Hi, everybody, and hello from Dubai. Unfortunately, I could not be in class today, but I did not want to get far behind with our material, and I feel that we need to go over the Congress of Vienna and Concert in Europe so that you are fully aware and understand what it is. When we get to the AP exam in May, there's only relatively few treaties that you really need to know details about. The Peace of Augsburg, the Treaty of Westphalia, the Treaty of Versailles, and the Congress of Vienna. Thus, one of my reasons for creating this lecture for you to watch and take notes on. So as we get started, I have a quote here that discusses, oops, so sorry. As we get started, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to show you this quote that discusses basically the ideas that are occurring during this time period about the Congress and a little bit about it. So this quote says the Emperor of Russia loves for them all, the King of Prussia thinks for them all, the King of Denmark speaks for them all, the King of Bavaria drinks for them all, and the King of Württemberg eats for them all, and the Emperor of Austria pays for them all. And I like to go over this quote with students because it gives you an idea of what exactly this Congress of Vienna was. It was a very important meeting, of course, that is going to make a pretty significant difference in relations for the next 50 to 100 years. But it was also a big party, as you can see by some of the things here. The European nobles, the monarchies, felt relieved to be over Napoleon. There was a brief period where Napoleon returned for the 100 days in the middle of the conference, and they had to go and fight him, eventually defeat him at the Battle of Waterloo. But by and large, the Napoleonic period was over. And for European monarchs and nobility, they thought they were going back to the old regime, the Ancien regime, the way it was. But that wasn't really all that possible. In addition, the Congress of Vienna was dominated, despite the fact that there were hundreds of people there, it was really dominated by the big four. Some historians may say the big five. And the most significant was the host, the Austrian Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich. Von Metternich was a reactionary. He really would have liked to turn back to the way it was. However, he was also a realist and pragmatic, and he made issues. And it's really, he is coming into this situation as the foreign minister of the Austrian Empire. And I have a map here. Austria was very different than the other countries because it was so multinational, than some of the other countries because it was so multinational, right? The Germans, who predominated in Austria, mostly lived in that region there in the yellow, dominated the country, but there were several ethnic groups, the Hungarians, the Italians, Romanians, Poles, Czechs, different Slavic groups, and so forth. And these groups wanted anything but, or these groups in many cases have been inspired by the nationalism of the Napoleonic Wars, and Metternich wanted them to have anything but nationalism. In fact, he's going to make attempts to squash nationalism. Also, as a reactionary, he was opposed to the liberal ideas of the French Revolution. And again, would really prefer to turn back the clock to the way things were beforehand. In addition to Metternich, the other mostly significant person was Tsar Alexander I of Russia. Like Metternich, he too was a reactionary, although he did have what I would say are some delusions of grandeur. If you remember, Napoleon's troops were defeated after they invaded Russia. And so Tsar Alexander, for the most part, felt very secure in his role as the savior of Europe. But other nations weren't so convinced. The three other dominant powers that were there were the British, led by Lord Viscount Castlereagh. I would say that Castlereagh was the most pragmatic of the group of five. And for the most part, he really was opposed to, especially the ideas of Tsar Alexander. He did not like some of the conflicts that were going on, and he did not want to essentially give too much power to the Russians during the conference. The least significant would be Count von Hardenberg of Prussia, who I would say, for all practical purposes, don't worry about. But then there is also Maurice de Talleyrand from France. And this is where we see something unusual for a conference. The fact that Talleyrand was representing defeated France. And the fact that Talleyrand was actually able to play some of the powers against each other. He did a really good job at making sure that France's defeat was not total. And unlike, for those who've ever studied World War I and World War II, unlike the results of World War I, which led to World War II indirectly, the results of the Congress of Vienna really led to what historians call the peaceful 19th century, as we're going to see no European major wars between 1815 and 1914. For the period we've been discussing in the course, this will be the longest gap in warfare. The second longest is actually the modern period from 1945 to 2026. That said, it was Metternich's principles to establish European stability that predominated in Europe. And those principles, the most significant for Metternich was the idea of legitimacy. And you'll read more about that in the reading below. For Metternich, he wanted to restore the legitimate monarchies to Europe, restore the Bourbons to Spain, the Bourbons to France in particular, and expel the Bonapartes, get rid of that as well. In addition to restoring these ancient families, he also wanted to contain France, and he designed a series of countries meant to keep France from expanding, as I'll show you in a minute on the map. This kind of goes with the balance of power. They also wanted to make France pay for the war, and they made the reparations high enough that France did have to pay some. In fact, they increased it after the 100 Days, but not so high that France was crippled. And in fact, within 3 years, France was able to pay their reparations and compensate for the war. And probably the most significant, long-lasting, was to establish what was called the balance of power, right? And the idea behind the balance of power was to make sure that no one country could ever get as powerful as the French had gotten during the Napoleonic era and before. And this comes into where containment comes in. For example, this country of Piedmont, Sardinia, which is this little country in the brown, was created to keep French from expanding in the south, right? The former Austrian Netherlands, or modern-day country of Belgium, was given to the Dutch Republic, and combined the two created the Kingdom of the Netherlands, briefly, to keep France from expanding in the north. Prussia was enlarged to also keep France from expanding westward. And the idea behind the balance of power, again, was that the nations would work together. And in fact, the best example of balance of power would be the Quadruple Alliance, in which the four major victors, Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, and Russia, agreed to ally together to prevent future wars. This was unheard of in Europe at this point, that the four major powers are. And interestingly, when France pays her debts to the European countries by 1818, they join the Quadruple Alliance, renaming it the Quintuple Alliance. And for the next 30 or so years, these five major powers, the dominant powers of Europe, will actually work together to keep the peace. It doesn't last past 1848 and will definitively be broken by 1853. But nonetheless, this idea that the major powers could work together to ensure peace and ensure a balance of power was a first for European diplomacy. You'll read more about the Quadruple Alliance and Tsar Alexander's Holy Alliance in the subsequent reading that follows. Coming from the Quadruple and Quintuple Alliance is the creation of what historians call the Concert of Europe. Some might refer to it as the Metternich system. And essentially, these were regular meetings to settle international problems. Again, as I had said previously, the big four or five had now were coming together and were actually able to work together to settle these problems. And as they do this, they meet, they're going to deal with issues. For the most part, they were opposed to both liberalism and nationalism, somewhat, right, when it suited them. And especially Metternich tried to squash both liberal and nationalist revolts throughout Europe. Furthermore, they often squash rebellions, but not always, right? You heard me say earlier that historians refer to this as the peaceful 19th century because there's only really one major war between 1815 and 1914. But it was also a revolutionary century. There were revolutionary outbursts in 1820, the big revolutions in 1830, and 1848 even more so. And in all these rebellions and others, we're going to see the Concert of Europe either decide to crush them or allow moderate change to come about. But again, it's the major powers coming together, meeting as this Concert of Europe to do this. right? An example, in Italy and Spain, both countries had liberal revolts, and in Italy, the Italian states, there was nationalistic revolts to unite the Italian peninsula. Metternich and company crushed these revolts. Didn't quite happen. The Bourbon monarchy remained in Spain as an absolute monarchy, and the Italians remained divided until 1861. Interestingly, Latin America was a different story. The Latin American countries began their revolt against Spanish control during Napoleonic rule in Spain. And after Napoleonic rule, the countries of Europe discussed helping Spain to reclaim Latin America. The British rebelled against this. They said absolutely not. The British found that they could profit by trading with Latin America, and they did not want to restore Spain's power. So most of Latin America will become independent in the period following this, and the Consul of Europe did nothing to crush those revolts. There was also a revolt in Greece against the Turks. And at this point, members of the Council of Europe agreed to support an independent Greece from the Ottoman Empire, interestingly giving them a German monarchy, though. And finally, in 1830, the Belgians revolted from the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and the Council of Europe met and agreed to Belgian independence, ensuring that Belgium would be a neutral nation. And overall, historians would mostly say the foreign policy that resulted from the Council of Europe and the Congress system were successful. For example, again, this peaceful, for the most part, stable Europe. There were wars, but they were limited in nature. They weren't Europe-wide, and that really continues for almost 100 years, right, until World War One. Furthermore, the Congress did condemn the slave trade. There was this recognition, although they didn't outright ban slavery, there was this recognition that um, kidnapping people in the African continent and bringing them to the Americas was something that nations shouldn't be doing, and they universally condemned it. But there were some failures as well. The Congress did not take into account the growing liberalism and nationalism that had started during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic period, right? Again, there were liberal revolts in 1820, revolutions of 1830, even more so. And in 1848, revolutions broke out throughout the continent, a concept we'll discuss later on, and that you'll read something about in the following reading. That is it for now. And again, I will be back in class, I think on Wednesday. So I should see you later this week. And that will be it for now. Just go on ahead and make sure you finish the assignment and submit it before the end of the class. Take care.